Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Judge Sam Chung from the King County Superior Court, and welcome to our webinar on anti-Asian violence and discrimination titled, Where Are You Really From? Today's program is presented by the Courts and Community Committee of this court in recognition of the Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month of May. Our committee presents many programs throughout the year in order to engage with and to give back to the various communities we serve. And we invite you to join our other programs as shown on our community engagement page from the court's main website. Before I announce and introduce our guests, I have a couple of announcements to make. Today's panel discussion will be about an hour. We also want to reserve about 10 minutes at the end so we can address any questions from the audience through the chat room. We're also making available a report on anti-Asian violence and hate crimes that was published earlier last year for the Asian American Bar Association of New York by the Paul Weiss Law Firm. And we have a link on that and on our court's website. Our program today is being carried live on TVW, and we're also recording it to make it available later through the court's YouTube website. We have exceeded our capacity for a webinar, and if you know people who cannot get on our webinar, please let them know about the TVW live stream, so they can watch the program that way. I also want to have a couple of thank yous to announce. First, to our court's leadership, Presiding Judge Jim Rogers, Assistant Presiding Pat Oishi, and the two co-chairs of this committee, Judges Sandra Widlin and Michael Scott, for all their concerns on the issues to be addressed today. Many thanks goes to all of our staff, especially Jim Peterson, Beth Taylor, and Amy Rowe for all their work in putting this together. We are truly honored to present this program to you today through four very accomplished individuals. They are Ms. Mimi Jung, who, as many of you know, is a news anchor for King 5 News. She joined King 5 in 2000 and is currently a co-anchor of the King 5 morning program. I won't ask her what time she got up this morning. She will be moderating and leading our panelists today. We are also honored to have Ms. Naomi Ishisaka from the Seattle Times. Ms. Ishisaka is the paper's Assistant Managing Editor for Diversity, Inclusion, and Staff Development. Her inspiring and thought-provoking column on race, culture, equity, and social justice appears weekly on Mondays. Professor Margaret Chon teaches at the Seattle University School of Law, where she is the Donald and Lynda Horowitz Professor for the Pursuit of Justice. She has written extensively on a variety of areas, including race, and I know that there are many fans of Professor Chon in the audience today. Last but not least, we have Justice Yu from our State Supreme Court, where she has been serving as an Associate Justice since 2014. For Justice Yu, any attempt at an introduction would be a grave injustice. So I will just say that she has been a mentor to many people, including many current and aspiring judges, lawyers, and youths. I would also note that she recently was a guest on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Seriously, we are deeply fortunate and honored to have these four very truly accomplished women of color with us today. I can only imagine all the barriers and obstacles they must have encountered and all the glass ceilings they have shattered and continue to shatter throughout their careers. That could be a subject for an entire conference. We therefore honor them and celebrate these four guests on this AAPI Heritage Month and thank them for their willingness and their courage to share their thoughts on this critical issue. So please join me and give them a big warm welcome to all of them. Thank you. I now turn it over to our moderator, Mimi Jung.
Judge Chon, thank you so much. And I just want to echo what you said about these three women on this panel. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation, especially among such accomplished and inspiring women as you. So thank you for being here. And we want to have a really candid conversation today. So I hope that people who are watching and listening will walk away feeling empowered by what you hear, the personal stories that they will be sharing, and the incredible insight that they will be offering you. I want to start though by just hearing from each one of our panelists. Since it is AAPI Heritage Month, I want to know from each of you, what does that mean for you? So Professor Chon, let's start with you.
Thank you, Mimi. And I also want to start by thanking Judge Chung and all of the folks who put this program together, and with the land acknowledgement, just very briefly, that I respectfully acknowledge that our event today is taking place on occupied Coast Salish land, and pay respect to the elders, past and present, extend that respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. So I don't know if any of you can see the writing on my screen. It's a virtual screen, but this month means a month of inspiration, reflection and inspiration. And I'm so inspired by everyone who's with us today on this panel. But I'd like to also give a shout out to our Vice President, Kamala Harris, who is the first person of Asian ancestry, as well as Black ancestry, to be a Vice President of the United States. And the quote here is, "We've got to do the work to fulfill that promise of equal justice under law, because none of us are free until all of us are free," which I think is a beautiful quote. So thank you.
Naomi, what does AAPI Heritage Month mean to you?
Yeah, thank you. I also just wanted to say thank you to Judge Chung and for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here, and such an honor to be on this panel with these incredible women. And thank you for moderating. You know, the question actually reminded me of a quote by Stephen Yun in the New York Times, who said, "Sometimes I wonder if the Asian American experience is what it's like when you're thinking about everyone else, but nobody is thinking about you." And I think that the Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month is really the one time that people think about Asian Americans, unfortunately, in this country. And I personally want us to get to a place where we don't need to have months that recognize specific communities, because we're thinking about them all the time. And I know we're a long way from that. And so at this point, you know, things like Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month is really important. But I want this kind of education, this kind of awareness building to be happening year round, whether it's October or February or whatever time of year it is. And I think that the more we have these conversations, the more we talk about it, the more possible that is. But I think I want to get to the point where people are thinking about Asian Americans all the time.
Justice Yu?
Yeah, I also want to just start with expressing my gratitude to Judge Chung for putting this together, and to thank my prior court for hosting it. I'm very impressed and delighted and honored to be here. And then finally, I want to thank Maggie for reminding us about the land that we are on, and that it belongs to the First Peoples. And so thank you very much for that. You know, as I think about API Heritage Month, you know, I share the thoughts of others in a sense. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on the wealth of our community and the different communities that make up sort of what we call Asian Americans. But I have to say that this year in particular, it has special meaning to me because of COVID and the hatred that was directed at us and the blame for COVID. And so this particular time in terms of this year and this month is really special to me because it allows us to talk about that, what it means to be the object of racism and the object of hatred. So we not only celebrate our communities, but I have found the whole month very therapeutic in terms of gathering with other people and seeing the beauty of our community and being proud of it.
And on that note, I want to start with the first question of this panel, which is, I want to hear your personal story. I want to hear your personal thoughts about how this last year, how seeing the hate and violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, how that has impacted you as an individual. Justice Yu, I want to start with you.
Sure. Well, you know, first of all, I'd have to say that for the first time ever, I was afraid. I was literally afraid to go out alone. I was afraid to go to the Home Depot. I was afraid to go out on the trail. And that's because I spend a lot of my time down here in Olympia and Lacey because of work. And I hadn't experienced that, I don't think, in my whole life, that I would have to be afraid because of what I looked like. You know, the title of this particular CLE is, right, where are you really from? Tell us where you're really from. I grew up in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, and everybody always asked me that, where are you from? And I'd say, well, the south side. And they'd say, no, where are you really from? And I'd say, the south side. I live on the south side of Chicago. But I knew, right, what they were really asking, because they still saw me as a newcomer, even though I was born on the south side of Chicago. So, you know, this whole year, again, taught me something that I didn't know, and that is fear. And I didn't let it overwhelm me, but it was really good to recognize that no matter who you are, no matter what status that you have in life, it doesn't matter, that you are still seen the same, and people can't objectify you so easily. It's made me more sensitive to others, in my view.
Naomi, how has this last year impacted you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, similar to what Judge Yu said, I think when the pandemic first started, I was really, really concerned about sort of the hyper-visibility at the time of Asian Americans, and in particular, you know, wearing a mask. And so I was constantly conscious of, you know, even though I wanted to wear a mask, I was afraid to wear a mask because I didn't want to be, you know, targeted because I was wearing one, which is a terrible way to make a, you know, a public health or safety, personal safety calculation. But I was always conscious, as, you know, someone that deals with asthma in particular, that anytime I coughed, it could potentially make me a target by someone who was thinking, oh, this person has COVID because they're Asian, and therefore we're going to need to, like, you know, take some kind of action. So similarly, you know, I was very fearful. And I remember the first time I went to a supermarket where other people were wearing masks, and I was so relieved. I was like, oh, thank God, I'll be able to, you know, keep myself safe, while at the same time, you know, keep myself doubly safe from anti-Asian violence, but also safe from COVID. But I shouldn't have had to make that calculation. I shouldn't have having to fear, you know, coughing in public, and having, you know, someone attack me for that, you know. So I think there's a lot of experiences this past year that have really pulled back the curtain on things that have existed for a really long time, but we're just seeing them in a much sharper relief now, I think.
And Professor Chon, what sort of emotions have you gone through witnessing these crimes and hearing about them?
Thank you for that question. You know, I'll be honest, I don't walk around with fear. I don't go around feeling fear, but I do feel a lot of concern for different people. And that includes my students, my 89-year-old mother who lives here in Seattle with a lot of other elderly Asian folks. And fortunately, although I've been sort of monitoring their safety, so far they have not been subjected, as far as I know, to any sort of outright acts of violence, but I worry about it every day. I also want to say that I have a very, very close family member whose identity that I won't reveal for purposes of privacy, who was attacked last summer and was badly beaten in front of a lot of witnesses at a Target store. And I think that it was probably a hate-based crime, but it's not going to be pursued as such. And so I think the upside, though, the positive of all of this is that I'm talking more with my family. We grew up, like Justice Hugh, in the Midwest. I call it the Midwest. It was Buffalo, New York. So it was part of the Rust Belt, the Great Lakes area, where we were practically the only Asians growing up. And my siblings and I are now starting to have actually more meaningful discussions about race because it's just so in our face. I mean, I write about it and I've talked about it for a long time, but I think there's been a sort of repression that's happened in my family, which often happens in families that have been raised in predominantly white spaces. So that's been the positive, is that we're being more open and honest with each other about some of the things that we're seeing.
The Atlanta murders in March were really the tipping point for a lot of people. There was certainly growing attention on crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but that's really when people began speaking out. What is one question that you have received most often from people who are wondering how you're feeling, or what are your thoughts on the current state of affairs? Margaret?
The question that I've most received
And what do people ask you about most?
I think if I think about my students in particular, because those are the folks, my students and colleagues at school with whom I have the most contact, it's what can we do? What can we do? And we're feeling helpless. They're in law school. They presumably want to become lawyers to do something helpful for society through the legal system. And so that's the one question that I think I've heard most frequently.
And we'll answer that question a little bit later during this panel, because it is a really important question that I'm sure people who are tuning in want to know and want to be able to walk away from and be able to take action. What can we do? Naomi or Justice Yu, what about you? What sort of things, what feedback did you hear? What questions were you asked? What comments were made to you after the Atlanta murders?
I mean, I'll say for my readers, a couple of themes that emerged were one, why are you making such a big deal about this? Because, you know, there's no evidence that this was related to the race or gender of the people that were killed. So, you know, why do you have to make everything about race, basically, which is a really common refrain I get from my readers. And then the second one was, if it indeed was a hate crime, then why don't you support just broad-based more criminalization of all kinds of things, basically, you know, because I've written a lot about the pitfalls, and I know we'll probably talk about this later, but some of the pitfalls in taking a criminal legal system approach to social problems. And so the feedback I got from a lot of people were, then in that case, then, you know, we should just lock them up and throw away the key, and you should support that.
Justice Yu?
Yeah, you know, there were two questions. One, it's important for people to understand, because people said to me, why aren't you speaking out? Why don't you say something? And as much as I was compelled to want to say something, right, there are some limitations put on every single judge about how we speak or what we say in a particular circumstance. And even though that would not come before us in our jurisdiction, it's still inappropriate for a judge to comment on something specific like that. And very few people understand that. People just assumed, oh my gosh, you know, you're our highest elected official. Why don't you say something, speak out, or come to the rally? And I was asked to do that often, and it was very difficult, because of course I felt the same desire to do so. But again, there are just boundaries for judges, and we could speak as a court, and we did speak out as a court on race. But again, the opportunities to speak has to be done at an institutional level and not just individual judges taking up every particular event. So that was the greatest question that I received, or the greatest number. But the other is, people also said, how do you survive? How do you stay positive? And for me, that's easy, is in terms of, it was an opportunity, right, to see the level of care and compassion and how many people really do care. That sustains me through difficult times, is knowing how much people really do care, even if they don't act, but the expression of it really fortified my faith in humanity.
Naomi, I want to get back to what you said, the question, very common question from your readers, you know, why is this about race? Or perhaps some people are wondering, why is this such a big deal? I had one person respond to my tweet one day and said, people get attacked every day.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this such a big deal? Why is this leading the news? Can you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sheer horror of this incident that killed 6 Asian American women in one 4 or so hour period, I think was shocking and horrifying, and hit a lot of people where they live, literally, in the sense that, you know, they were at their jobs, they were doing their work, they were just trying to live their lives, and this person came and took their lives in such a horrifying manner. I think it was just such a I mean, yes, we just had another mass shooting this morning. These are happening on an ongoing basis, but because 6 of the 8 were Asian American women, and they were targeted, particularly according to the person who was arrested, because he felt like there were a temptation, as he put it, a temptation that he wanted to eliminate. I think that just hit a lot of us really hard. And there's also this whole dynamic that I'm sure Professor Chun will talk about later, where there's always been this sort of belief that some people belong and some people don't belong in this country, and the workers who were killed, the women that were killed, have long fallen into the category of people that don't belong. And I think that's part of sort of the subtext of all of this that we need to talk about.
Professor Chon, I want to add any thoughts to that in terms of this feeling of not belonging, feeling of being a perpetual foreigner, and perhaps that is part of what is the underlying pain and hurt that comes out when we hear or see stories of people being yelled at or attacked, or the target of racial slurs or hate speech and hateful language.
Thank you. I think this is a very pervasive, very long-standing attitude and sort of emotional reaction towards Asians in the United States. And I want to quote from a professor at the University of Chicago. She's a well-known English professor who's written about citizenship. And she argues that the citizen is not a political subject, but rather someone with attachments and intentions and pain capacities, a subject of feelings, who longs for whatever everybody is said to long for, a world that allows access to belonging, a sense of unanxious general social membership that ought to be protected by the institutions that bind power to ordinary life. So that's a mouthful, but really what I and many other Asian Americans, I can't speak for all, but I would venture to say most, what I share with them with us is a perpetual anxiety about inclusion and belonging to the United States, about membership in this country. Asian Americans aren't viewed as simply Americans with full membership in this nation. And so this is, I think, one of our specific racial anxieties as compared to Black folks, for example, who were brought here involuntarily, no question, but they're no longer questioned regarding their nationality or citizenship. And that's something that we cope with. And of course, we talked about this wonderful title that Judge Chung came up with, Where Are You Really From? Because I would say I would put any money on the fact that every single Asian in the United States has been asked this question at least once, right? And so it really belies this idea that all of us have come as immigrants to the United States, except for the indigenous groups. And yet only some of us are seen as perpetually outside of the nation and as perpetually immigrants.
Justice, as we try to dive a little deeper in terms of the why, where does this pain and hurt come from, and where does this feeling of being a foreigner come from? Help us understand where that does come from.
Yeah, my own view is it comes from a long history of being objectified. This recent violence against Asians is not new in this country, and it's certainly not new in the Northwest. We have deep, deep roots of racism and white supremacy. The Exclusion Act that excluded Chinese, the Tacoma purging of Chinese, is all very real in our history. And I think there are people still, right, who can tell you the first eye accounts of what it meant to be walked off Bainbridge Island because of Japanese Americans. So it's not new, and it's really very important for people to understand it's nothing that we have done, right? We become the scapegoat for so many other things, and it's just easy. And it may be easy because some of us culturally are just not in your face about them confronting that hatred. And what has happened is a new awakening. We have learned so much from others about what it means to push back, to challenge, to not accept it. But it's certainly not something new. And where it comes from, again, is others. It's not something that we should criticize ourselves for in terms of the feeling. It comes from oppression and hatred and being the object of that.
And I don't know.
Mimi, can I just add something to that?
Yeah,
I think another subtext of that is this lack of awareness and understanding that I was talking about at the beginning, which is that, you know, ethnic studies in this country is sorely lacking and people aren't learning this history. I mean, Asian Americans don't know a lot of this history, to be honest. And I think that there's a lot of work that we have to do to get people to the place where they're actually knowing about what happened in Tacoma. They're actually knowing what happened in the incarceration. And I think there was a stat last week, and correct me if I have this wrong, but it was something like 80% of people could not name a single Asian American person in the United States. And to me, that's so telling, and that speaks, and it's hard for us sometimes in places like Seattle, where we have a really large Asian American population, to imagine that being true. I mean, Mimi, you're on, you know, TV every single day. But that said, you know, there's large swaths of the country where you could, you know, travel all day and never see an Asian person. So I think there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do as a culture and society to get to a place where this information, this knowledge is something that we just learn as we go through our, you know, schooling. And it would be an abomination to not know about the incarceration, it'd be an abomination to not know about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And we have a long, long way to go to get there.
Absolutely.
When I could just add to that, just very briefly, I had the privilege of hearing Ibram X. Kendi speak at the Seattle Arts and Lecture recently. And what he said about education, I just want to underscore what Naomi just said. He said it's much easier to learn anti-racism than to unlearn racism, right? And so it really does start at the elementary and middle and upper levels of education, where we present our kids and young adults with a more authentic version of our history, because we're really we're in a state of permanent racism, which may sound a little bit pessimistic. It's been called Afro-pessimism, but I would think it's realistic that we're still very much in denial of our country's history of genocide with respect to the indigenous population, as well as the forced enslavement and genocide, in a sense, of folks brought from Africa. So until we come to a reckoning with some of those past aspects of our shared racial history, which still have many ramifications today, we're not going to be able to be in a place where we can have a national conversation.
And because I don't want to, I want this to be educational, and I don't want to just gloss over some of the things such as the Exclusion Act and the incident that Justice you referred to in Tacoma. I want to use this moment to, if you can briefly explain to the people who are listening and watching what we are talking about, because there are so many people who are completely unaware of the Chinese Exclusion Act and other historical references to racism and discrimination against Asian Americans. So who wants to take that on?
Professor Chon.
Well, I mean, there's so much to say, and like, as Naomi pointed out, there are whole courses of ethnic studies devoted to some of this history. But just let me point out that the Pacific Northwest states were not directly involved in the slave trade. And so oftentimes folks here feel, well, we're innocent, right? But Oregon was the only state to be admitted to the US in 1859 as a whites-only state, which is a provision of the Oregon Constitution not repealed until 1926. It also did not ratify the 14th Amendment until 1973. That's within my lifetime. And it was one of 6 states that refused to ratify the 15th Amendment. And it wasn't until 2000 that the Oregon legislature voted to remove all racist references to its laws. California, of course, has its own very complex history of anti-Asian campaigns. And I don't want to sort of give you a lecture. But we've already noted in this discussion that Washington State has had its own exclusionary history. And some of you may know this, but it bears repetition that the King County Bar Association of this county was founded in 1886 in response to attorney involvement in mob effort to deport Chinese citizens. And that's on its website. Like many other states, Washington State had an alien land law, in this case as part of our state constitution, prohibited those ineligible for citizenship under our naturalization laws, that is non-whites, people who are legally non-white, to hold property. And that included East Asians and many other folks. And then we've already mentioned the Japanese American incarceration. And so there's so many examples of things that are not generally taught, or perhaps they are taught, but students aren't listening well. But I know from my own experience that these were not things I was made aware of when I was growing up, which I hope now students are made more aware of.
You know, and Mimi, I'll just add, because also somebody asked about the Tacoma method, and you can literally type that into any search engine on the internet, and it'll come up and tell you about it and have photographs documenting this event. And this occurred in 1885. And what it was literally the purging of Tacoma of Chinese. And so they literally went house to house to pull out those who were Chinese and purged and torched their homes. And it was thereafter that occurred in Seattle, what Professor Chon just mentioned, right? Marching Chinese down to the docks in Seattle in order to put them on a ship to get rid of them. This is important history for people to know, but as others have said, this is almost a whole course on trying to understand and draw that line through our state's history.
Mm-hmm. And Judge Chung wanted us to mention Vincent Chen, the Vincent Chen case, which for people who aren't aware of his murder and what happened afterwards, why is that so important to the history for Asian Americans?
I think the Vincent Chen case was another example of sort of this economic and social anxiety that manifests itself in a completely misplaced, and that the idea that his attackers had was that he was Japanese American and was taking jobs away from auto workers in the Detroit area, and of course he was Chinese American, and of course none of that was happening. But as we've seen over and over in the course of our history, Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, at the turn of the century, were, as you know, Professor Chon said, scapegoated and used as sort of a wedge to be the kind of the blame for why you couldn't get a job. It was because of the Chinese Americans were taking your jobs, and then it became this sort of like us versus them mentality that then resulted in all this anti-Asian, anti-Chinese attacks and hate, like what happened to Vincent Chen.
And Mimi, the one thing I would add for some of our audience as lawyers, I think what the sting is of Vincent Chen, right, is the failure to prosecute properly and hold people accountable for a hate crime. It was never designated a hate crime. There was no opportunity for the community to come together and feel that there was justice that was done. So when people ask, well, why hate crimes, or why use the criminal legal system to achieve this? And it really isn't, because I share Naomi's values that's not always the answer. And we're not looking for more people to be incarcerated. It's about accountability. It's also just acknowledgement and perhaps an apology that this is the motivation and that there's regret for an action. But the fact that that didn't happen is why it stands out so clearly as that our lives don't matter, and it didn't matter.
Yeah. I think the murder of Vincent Chen, which took place in 1983, has to be seen against the backdrop of, there was an economic recession going on at the time. Motor City, Detroit, was under siege because of the import of Japanese-made automobiles. And I was living in Michigan at the time. I was actually in graduate school and law school in the early to mid 80s. And you could not find a Japanese car dealer there. There was literally none. And the feeling that I had when I moved here to Seattle about 15 years later, 10 or 15 years later, and seeing that Nintendo was a co-sponsor of the Mariners and that Ichiro was one of the main stars, right? Which gave me a lot of Asian pride, but it was so jarring to me at first because in Michigan, you just tried to downplay the fact that you were Asian American for fear that somebody might mistake you for, the enemy, so to speak, whether it was the economic competition or perhaps some lingering feelings from World War II or some other wars fought in Asia.
Naomi, I want to ask you about an article that you wrote in which you said, yet while I was grateful to see attention finally begin to focus on the wildly diverse, fastest growing segment of our population, I also felt uneasy. Help us understand what makes you feel uneasy about the spotlight on Asian Americans right now.
Yeah, and I think part of the unease is that, you know, as folks across the spectrum begin to understand kind of the nuances and complexities of a lot of these attacks that have been happening, there's also been sort of this reflexive effort to take what is a longstanding trope of anti-Black racism and use Asian Americans as a wedge against African Americans, as has been the case over the course of our history many, many times over. And you're seeing that happen again in the wake of these attacks. And I actually have a reader who sends me every example of a Black person attacking an Asian person. He sends them to me every single day to kind of prove his point that that what we need to be doing is basically locking up and incarcerating more Black people as a way to solve anti-Asian hate. And I think that's a kind of a blunt example, but I think it's a telling one, in the sense that there's a lot of people who are trying to use these cases as a way to further marginalize and oppress Black people. And I think as Asian Americans, we need to be really conscious of how those dynamics are playing out. Be really vigilant about where we're seeing them, and then push back really hard when they emerge. And so I think that that's the unease that I feel, is, are we going to again be used as a wedge to perpetuate people's agendas who actually aren't looking to uplift Asian Americans or African Americans? They're trying to advance a more white supremacist agenda, which is, I think, something that we should all be, very vigilant about.
And I don't know about you guys, but just seeing and hearing people speak out among the Asian American community, using their voices and having other people amplify our voices is unusual. I've never experienced that. And personally for me, I get what Naomi feels. It's uneasy for me because it seems odd. I don't really know what to do with that. On the one hand, I feel really empowered. On the other hand, it feels very strange. Can any of you relate to that?
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that it is a little jarring, right? To see the Asian American community come out, and then others come out to support us. And yet I have to admit that my greatest hope is that particularly the Asian American community is going to use this as a moment for us to speak out on behalf of others as well. That the lesson is not just to say, yes, I too now can speak, or actually I'm embarrassed that I'm the object of this. No, this is a moment for us to stand in solidarity with others. This is a moment to say, right, all hate is awful and bad and must be rejected. And we have to stand more than ever closely aligned with the African American community. We must stand as one with the Black community, especially in the Northwest. We have always had a good relationship, but I think now is the time to not just say we have relationships, right? But we share power, we share prestige, and we're going to share our voice. And that is so important today more than ever. What a moment, right? To be in solidarity together.
How do we create that unity between marginalized groups and be able to come together?
Yes, I think that's a really excellent question. I was about to jump onto the end of Justice Yu's comments about the need to be in solidarity, which I completely agree with, and then the reality of how difficult that can be. It's very, very difficult for us within the Asian American community, to address anti-Black racism within our communities. I know that there are some people, including some judges present today, who've tried to facilitate those kinds of conversations. And what I think is happening right now is sort of a type of democratic discourse that can be deeply uncomfortable. And our discomfort with it is good. It's a good thing, but we have to learn to live with the fact that being uncomfortable is okay. right? It's okay because we're having difficult conversations. These conversations are not supposed to be conversations that, or feedback, for example, to people about things that they may have said or attitudes or beliefs that they may have. They're not supposed to be fun or gratifying. They are supposed to be questioning and raising awareness. And that's what plurality and democracy really should be all about. It's about broadening the conversation so that we stand in solidarity, but we all have to understand each other's perspectives first. And in the same way that I think Asian American communities have to get around this issue of anti-Black racism within our communities, there are other communities of color that have the same issues with respect to Asian Americans. And so we all have to do our own work on this.
Justice Yu, I want to ask you about the court taking some big steps in addressing race and racism. What kind of changes are being made in the legal community on this?
Well, as you may know, Mimi, the Supreme Court issued a letter to the legal community on June 4th last year that was, frankly, monumental in terms of our court stepping up and speaking out and giving other judges permission to speak, to reject racism out loud. And that's just because, right, as judges, we wonder what we should say out of fear of somehow tainting ourselves as not being neutral. And yet we needed to say, right, that silence in the face of racism has nothing to do with neutrality. We must speak out against hatred and racism. And we did that as a court, and we called upon the legal community to do some serious self-reflection that might lead to transformation, to change the way we operate, to change the way we think, to have not only individual, but collective responsibility for where we are. So for us, it might be rejecting prior cases that were wrong and harmful. It might be, as we are doing now, we are undertaking a statewide effort to examine ourselves, to ask ourselves, when do we exclude others? How inclusive are we? How welcoming are our courthouses, much less our courtrooms? If somebody from our community wanted to proceed and assist in the prosecution of a crime, would they feel comfortable? Would they feel okay about having an interpreter? Is an interpreter even available? So there's so many things that we as a court can do to advance this sense of belonging and inclusivity in a real and meaningful way. And we launched it. So I think, right, there's a role for every judge and every court to step up. This CLE today, right, is this court making a statement to say, this is important to us to host this conversation. And that's the role that we can play. We shouldn't be on the sidelines. We shouldn't be silent. What and how we say it must, of course, be carefully constructed. But we are part of the community and we care very much.
And Professor Chon, I want to hear from you about what law schools are doing within legal education to combat racism as well.
Thanks. The racial reckoning that we're facing right now, based on what happened a year ago, yesterday with George Floyd, his murder, has really propelled a number of different initiatives, both locally with individual law schools as well as nationally. So I can say from a local perspective that our school has adopted a racial justice learning outcome, which means that by the time a student graduates, that student will have been in a class where issues about racial justice are discussed and analyzed, in addition to the Black letter law of torts and contracts. And in fact, what's so interesting is that, racial justice permeates every single area of law. It's not a separate thing, right? It's not even confined just to the criminal justice system, which is where so many people locate their thoughts, but it's really, I teach it in civil procedure. You can teach it in another course that I do, intellectual property, copyrights and patents. It's just everywhere. Its fingerprints are everywhere, but we have learned to teach lawyers to be as if, it doesn't exist. So it's the proverbial elephant in the room. On the national level, the ABA has a new proposal out, which is available for comment. It's in the public notice and comment period, and it's a proposed revision. So the ABA, the American Bar Association, is one of the two accrediting bodies for law schools in the United States. And the proposed standard is that US law schools will provide training to law students or cross-cultural competency, racism, and bias training at the start of law school or sometime before graduation. I think it's a start. It's not quite as ambitious as what Justice Yu mentioned with regard to the court system in Washington State. It's not asking law schools or requiring them to really dig down deep and take a hard look at some of our teaching practices, frankly, or some of the other curriculum that we have unthinkingly had over years without revision with regard to race. But it is a start, so I'm optimistic.
Naomi, I want to ask about your profession. You're the managing editor for diversity, inclusion, and staff development. So what can coworkers and managers do, or what's happening within your workplace to fight anti-racism?
Yeah, I mean, we have a number of different efforts that we have been working on for a really long time. And I think one of the things that I'm really proud of is that unlike some newsrooms, like we didn't just start thinking and working on this after the summer and the reckoning that's been happening. This has been ongoing. We were one of the first newsrooms to start capitalizing B in Black in November of 2019, and now I think it's actually AP style. I'm not sure, but it's now totally commonplace in the media. So I mean, we know that there's never going to be a point in which we're done with this work. This is going to be ongoing. This is perpetual. This is forever. There's so much that we have to unlearn and unpack. And I was listening to the other panelists talk about the legal system, and I think there's actually a lot of parallels between the kind of history of media as well. Like media has long been a partner in advancing a lot of the marginalization of communities of color, and have I think many newspapers were actually champions of the internment incarceration of Japanese Americans, for example, and have often been on the wrong side of a lot of these issues. And so I think we have our own sort of work to do to take stock and be accountable for what we have done and the impacts it's had on people, especially as it relates to the criminal legal system, which we know has been terrible for communities of color for a very long time. And so I think we have a lot of work to do, but I'm really proud of the work that we're doing as a staff. And we have, dozens of people who are passionate about this. We have a whole team of folks who meet regularly to work on it. So I think that we know that there's a huge task ahead, but we also know that we are committed to it, and it's a huge priority for our newsroom. And that's something that is the reason why, I'm really proud to work at the Seattle Times.
I want to talk about the Hate Crimes Act that was just signed into law. I recently interviewed a student at Seattle University. She's one of the youth activists, has been leading some of the rallies locally. And it was right before President Biden signed that bill into law. And I said, aren't you encouraged by that? And she looked at me and she said, well, that's wonderful. But what is that really going to do? And I just thought, well, that was I wasn't expecting that answer. How do you all feel about having a hate crimes act? And what do you think it will do?
Mimi, I have to say that I heard Senator Hirono speaking, who, was the champion of this act, and how much meaning it had to her, in the sense that this was the institution, the greatest institution in her mind too, right? The federal government recognizing the fact that people objectify us and hate us and will commit crimes against us simply because of who we are in terms of what we might look like. And that's not exclusive to Asian Americans, right? This is true for the LGBTQ community. This is true for other individuals. But the fact that it was acknowledged, especially the long, deep history of anti-Asian sentiment in this country, it was very significant to just even have it acknowledged. Again, there's dispute, right, about whether or not the criminal legal system is the answer and whether this is really going to reduce crime in some way. But what it was an acknowledgement that there is somebody who is committing crimes against somebody because of a characteristic. And so I think that's why it's important.
Naomi, Professor Chon, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do.
Go on, Naomi.
I agree with Justice Yu that it is an important institutional signal. I worry about the focus on crime and criminality and how that might feed into longstanding issues within the criminal justice system. But I do think it is an accomplishment within the bounds of, our structure of government. I mean, there are lots of other things that we can do to push forward awareness of anti-Asian bias and try to do prevention. But it is something that I think stands as a sort of a federal imprimatur on this idea that the government is not going to tolerate certain kinds of attacks on people of Asian ancestry.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. And I think that, we know that hate crimes are underreported. We know that especially in the Asian American community, they're incredibly underreported. And there's been a lot of efforts to try to increase the amount of visibility. And I think that those efforts are super important. And if this hate crime legislation actually helps in any of that, I think that's great and something that was needed. But to kind of reinforce, what Professor Chon was saying, I think that there's a lot of concern that I have, and I know others share as well, that we have a hard time. We've always had a hard time in these types of situations, like grappling with complexity. And I think that this is one of the areas that we have to really be willing to grapple with that complexity. And so, for example, in several of the cases that I've written about that took place in San Francisco and the Bay Area, the perpetrators of the crimes were African-American who were longstanding community members who had struggled with mental health issues and substance use addiction disorder. And those cases don't fit neatly into our idea of what a hate crime is. And the remedy that those individuals needed was not found behind jail cell bars, right? The interventions that those individuals needed in order to prevent the incidents from happening was mental health treatment, was substance use disorder treatment, were all the things that don't make for great headlines, but are actually the things that our communities most need. And so I want us to shift into a conversation that's more about what public safety really looks like for everyone. And to me, public safety looks like people who have access to the housing and education, economic security that they need in order to thrive and survive. It means that people are able to get the help they need if they're struggling with addiction or mental illness. And those things aren't in place, right? So it's great to have this as a tool in the toolbox, but it's not going to be the panacea that I think a lot of people are sort of making it out to be, because those underlying conditions are still existing. And until we address those underlying conditions, we're just going to have the same problem repeated over and over. And the goal should not be successfully locking people up under hate crime legislation. The goal should be not having the hate crime happen in the first place, and not having the victims hurt in the first place. So that's my thinking.
One of you mentioned earlier that it's easier to learn anti-racism than to unlearn racism. So how can one be anti-racist? Professor Chon?
That is a softball question, Mimi, right?
Fix it.
You hit me the hard one, actually. So what I would say, just to tag on to, just before we move on from the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, is that it does provide funds for public education. And so public education campaigns about bias. And so I do think that feeds into my comments here, which really is about education. I said this earlier, and I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I think we need to be rethinking our curriculum from K through whatever level of education you want to go through. But each of these different stages of human development and growth through education needs to include much more awareness and critical thinking skills and other kinds of skills, because addressing these issues is not just an intellectual, analytical type of exercise. This is very hard emotional work as well. And it involves acknowledgement, it involves awareness, it involves recognition, it involves forgiveness. And what we've been doing as en masse is really forgetfulness, right? It's willed forgetting, to use a historian's term, about the Civil War. We've willfully forgotten a lot of our history. And so this excavation of our shared racial history and in the process learning to be anti-racist is really about sort of willed remembering. And that's a type of skill that involves a heavy emotional content, an affective content, as well as an analytical content.
You know, Mimi, I will just add to that because I think Maggie is so right on in terms of this requires such deep work and long-term work. But one of the things that helps people change their minds about others is an experience, right? An experience. Once you know somebody, people begin to shift a little bit in terms of the little box that they may have put us in. But the other, and I'll shift this back to you, Mimi, is right, the media and movies. So many people stop the stereotypes of LGBTQ people once they saw us on television, once they saw us living a normal life like them, right? Going to work, coming home. And the same is true, is that there needs to be an exposure of us on media, in film, in books, in poetry, but in every single way. The more visible we are and the more we are allowed to be visible, I think that begins to contribute to the breaking down of the stereotypes of who we are.
That's such a great point. And I said on another panel recently that we also have to be able to be our messy, flawed selves. I think sometimes when we first start to get representation, we're kind of like, well, we have to be perfect. We have to show ourselves as being completely flawless. And I think one of the things that we need to do as well is to show that we also can be wrong and problematic and messy and ugly and like all the things that humans are, because that's real. That's true. And there's no one particular group that is, and I think it goes into the model minority myth. It's like we have to break down that sort of the myth that's been created about our community.
We've got about 8 minutes left before we take questions, and I want to get to this this last major topic question before we wrap up, and that is, what can we do? What can our audience do to advocate for the AAPI community? If people are feeling helpless and not sure what to do, what would you advise? What would you say and suggest? Not everyone at once.
You know, I'll start it, but I know that my colleagues here have much to say on this as well, is call it out when you see it. It's so important that people lend their voices to others when they see something happen. That is just so important. But I think we've talked about, learn history, learn stories, open up your life to somebody else in terms of learning more about them. In some way. And I just have to say, I have so appreciated collegial support. My colleagues on the court have lent a lot of support personally, professionally. That matters. And there's always room for allies at every level, right? The intersectionality of being female, of being Asian, for me being Mexican, being a lesbian, right? The intersectionality of all of that provides an opportunity to say at the end of the day, right, we can do this together, we can be better. As a group and as a community.
Naomi?
Yeah, that's such a good question, such an important question. I think, I guess I would say resist the easy solutions. I think it's really tempting to try to reach for the low-hanging fruit in something like this, but I think what's more useful and more valuable is to take a slower, more thoughtful approach. And like, just as you said, think about what we don't know. And, getting back to that willful remembering or willed remembering, I think thinking about if there are gaps in our understanding or gaps in our knowledge, do the work yourself to figure that out and figure out what you don't know, what you might not have learned. There's, tons and tons of reading lists you can start with. There's so much information out there if you're interested in learning more, and there's no shortage of it out there. I think that another aspect of it too is just, you know, listening to people who've already been doing this work and already been working on these issues for a really long time, and ask them what they think should be done. I think a lot of times when people's attention sort of focuses on something for the first time, they're kind of like, well, I'm going to invent my new nonprofit to end racism. I actually have someone who sends me an email about this new nonprofit to end racism, and it involves like wearing a shirt that says end racism. And, you know, I appreciate the sentiment, I appreciate the effort. Is that going to end racism? I don't think so. And maybe that person's energy might be better spent partnering with a group that has been existing for a long time that they could, you know, lend their help to. So I think, you know, having the humility to recognize that this is not a new subject, new topic, and lending support to things that already exist, I think is a good way to start.
So I think this audience is probably self-selected to be open to some of these suggestions. And I'm sure that there are some law students and even lawyers in this audience, and court personnel and others. And so what I would say is just keep learning your craft, especially if you're a law student. It takes so much time to develop that skill set. And whatever profession you're in, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a lawyer, teacher, educator, these are really, really complex skills. So focus on those in addition to thinking about how you can bring anti-racism into whatever you do, and in addition to having those challenging conversations that I mentioned earlier.
What would you say to people who want to ask questions, want to approach you, colleagues of yours, who want to ask you and have this conversation? So they just don't really know how to begin. What do you say? You know, can you open up and just talk about, practically speaking, how to invite people into that space?
Yeah, I would say that people have a different level of tolerance and openness to those types of questions. And I'm someone who has a really, really high and open door policy for those kind of questions. I totally think that my role in the media and at the Seattle Times is to be kind of the bridge for someone who might be sort of tentatively getting their feet wet but not really sure where to go. Please ask what you want to know. That said, there's other folks that are tired, and not really willing to be that person, and that's okay too. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. But I think just asking, like, are you comfortable, if I ask you a few questions about this, and the person can say yes or no, but I think starting with that question is really important.
Okay, well, if no one else has any comments to that last question, I think we can turn it over to Judge Chung to take some questions from our audience at this time.
Thank you. I feel like all of our questions have been answered already. If you have questions to the panelists, please submit them on the chat. There have been a few questions. One in particular, what would you say to our young, to our kids who are growing up in this environment and facing these issues and seeing them on television? What would be an immediate message and a deeper message for down the road? I don't know if anyone could address that.
I think it's really important to say to young people that they belong and that they should be visible and that they should be whoever they are. I talked to a lot of different community groups, and when all of this COVID first started, I talked to a little Girl Scout troop. And there were probably 2 or 3 Asian girls in the group of maybe 20 or 22. And the first hand that went up was this little Asian girl who said, where did COVID come from? It was the most important question in her mind. Where did it come from? And I said, well, we don't really know. I said, it may have actually been something that came from an animal to a human in some way in terms of transmission. She said, I want to know, did it come from China? My heart just sunk, right? Because I thought, what did this little girl hear? And all I could say was, you know what? Yeah, it may have come from China, but it may have come from Europe too. right? They say that it may have come from Europe to New York. And then she thought, oh, okay, yeah, it was that simple in some ways. But gosh, I just thought, how do we somehow raise up these little voices and these young people to believe in themselves, not to buy into that they are anything other than right, good human beings capable of growth and giving us more. And I think how we say that is going to be communicated differently, whether somebody's in elementary school, high school, or whether it's a youngster that you're visiting at the juvenile detention center, right? Be visible and make sure that they know that they are accepted and loved in our community.
Anyone else on that subject?
I guess I think that young people, and by that I really think from newborn to, maybe not newborn, but very small to mid-20s, that's young for me, they pick up these ideas. They're kind of in the air, you know, the racism is in the air, it's what we breathe. And so where did that question come from for that little girl? And how is she going to make sense of it, given her particular cognitive bandwidth, you know, at her developmental stage? So, I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Asian American kids, that to try to be your authentic self, which does not necessarily mean being a model minority kid, but you can be a messy kid. You don't have to be what a super American, super, you know, sort of assimilated, perfect child, all of that. And you have the right not only to be yourself, but to ask questions, of course, in a civil way, hopefully, but to ask questions of your elders and to try to hold them accountable. My students do that with me. I saw one question actually in the chat that is trying to hold us a little bit accountable too. And that's okay, because that's feedback. And I would also say to the young folks, listen to the answers and don't presume that you were born yesterday, or that we were born yesterday, sorry, that your elders were born yesterday and don't have any experience. Because sometimes I get the feeling with especially some 20-somethings, and I'm going to be very frank, that they feel like this, you know, this social liberation movement was sort of came about because of what just during their lifetimes, right? And it's a much, much longer history of people passing the baton to each other, right? From one generation to the next. It's not going to end in my lifetime, I know that, and it's certainly not, I think, going to end in their lifetimes as well, because this is a very, very long process.
There's also a question regarding model minority, and all of you have accomplished so much, and I'm wondering whether you felt pressurized in a situation where you were expected to perform, and there are all these jokes about Asians being good at math and etc. How do you feel about those in the aftermath of Atlanta shootings now? Naomi?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the most troubling threads of feedback I got from readers after that, which was that, you know, why, if other groups were more like Asian Americans, then we wouldn't have racial problems in this country. And you know, I can't tell you how many emails I got to that effect. And it's a really hard thing to unpack, because I think people see it in some ways as a compliment, right? You're one of the good ones. You're one of the good Asians. And what it does, you know, in addition to sort of creating an impossible standard that very few people can actually meet, it also is a myth that actually hides what is true for a lot of Asian Americans, which is that, you know, the gap between the richest and the poorest Asian Americans is larger than any other group. And I think that for folks who are more on the margins of Asian American community, the model minority myth like really hides the truth around the same socioeconomic challenges that face folks who are on the economic and social margins, because you have this myth that there's no problem, right? So there's no need to provide support for Southeast Asian refugees, for example, because the model minority myth says that those folks don't exist, except for they do, you know? And so the problems, so you've got this whole issue around Cambodian deportation. And, you know, if the model minority myth holds, then that's not a problem, because there are no Cambodians who might be deported, because they're all, you know, rich, living crazy rich Asian lives, right? And so the model minority myth does a disservice not just to the society as a whole, not just a disservice to other communities of color, which is, I think, one of the worst manifestations of it, but it also does a disservice to Asian Americans as well.
Maybe it's because I've never been that model minority as a biracial person and a sassy person on top of it. But I just want to acknowledge that, just as a minority female, there's incredible pressure to not screw up, if you will, right? I'm so afraid of making a mistake because I don't want to mess it up for others. And that's a whole nother syndrome in terms of being the first in certain circumstances, is I just don't want to mess it up for somebody else. But I have to admit, because of my own sassiness and growth as a person, I haven't had to worry too much about that label.
Professor Chon?
Well, I don't want to end on a super academic note, but I'm actually in the middle of a book that is very good about the model minority myth. And it's by Ellen Wu. It's called The Color of Success, Asian Americans and the Origins of the Model Minority. It takes an historical perspective. It's very well documented. And it's a really rich description of how this was constructed to begin with. And it really dates back to the early 20th century. And in fact, part of the Japanese American community's quest to become American, to be fully American, despite the fact that Japan was our enemy. And so the Nisei 442nd, that was part of the model minority story. After the World War II, the Cold War, and the quest of Chinese Americans to be accepted by being anti-communist. So there was a ground set, a foundation set platform for this sort of construct of the good American being sort of hyper-patriotic, hyper-achieving, that kind of thing. And to go to what Naomi said earlier about it being a wedge, it was constructed in deliberate contrast to sort of bad minorities. So Asians can never be white, but we can be partially accepted if we buy into some of these sort of white middle class sort of aspirational traits, right, of being hardworking, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not Black either. And that was also part of the model minority, still is part of the whole model minority catch-22, is that we are people of color, but we are in some ways, the ticket for admission to be accepted is to pretend to be white, but we're not really white. And there's a good quote from Justice Goodwin Liu in the Paul Weiss report, where he says, he quotes, they're honorary whites until they're not, right? I should say we're honorary whites until we're not. And so there's sort of a conditionality always attached to being a model minority.
I think our time is up. A lot of judges have to go back on the calendar at 1:30. Mimi, do you want to add anything for the group?
I'm just reading some of the comments from people who are in the audience, just thanking all of you for your time and your candidness. So I just want to say thank you. I learned a lot just being a part of this conversation and really just inspired and empowered. I just want to thank you all for taking the time to be a part of this.
30 seconds from each of the panelists too as well.
I'll start again. I just want to express gratitude. Thank you. Thank you to this court. Thank you, Judge Chung. And thank you, Mimi, for your thoughtful questions.
Mm-hmm. And I'll add thanks to all the participants, the people who came today, for listening with open ears.
Yeah, same. And there were so many great questions that I know we didn't get to all of them, but if you have anything specific you want to ask me, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm very open and my email is everywhere, so.
All right, thank you very much. I'll try to follow up on some of the questions that we didn't get to address today after we finish today. I was going to say drive home safely, but I guess doesn't really apply because we're all remote. I thank you again for a wonderful conversation, and I hope we have these conversations again in the future. Mimi, I just want to thank you again for doing this, and I hope we didn't ruin your sleep time as a result. Thank you. Thanks to you and Professor Chon and Naomi. We'll close now and we're adjourned. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judge Chung.